Hello there, this short video is about bell curve thinking in education and about how challenging bell curve thinking can strengthen inclusive practice. So this is what a bell curve looks like. And when we talk about bell curve thinking, we're talking about this assumption that we've inherited that is most likely based on our own experiences of being a young person ourselves in schools, that you get this natural distribution of ability with any class or cohort of children and young people. So under bell curve thinking, there's this notion that in a class of say 30 children, around 4 to 6 will be more able, gifted and talented or high ability, and then on the other end there'll be 4 or 6 again that will be low ability and or have special educational needs, with low ability and special educational needs under bell curve thinking often being viewed as the same thing. And then with bell curve thinking, there is this sense that in a class of 30 pupils, that 20 or so will be average learners, the majority typical learners, middle ability. Now, we see bell curve thinking a lot in schools. We see it in school key processes and in the ways that learning's organised. We see it, for example, in lesson planning forms that require teachers to plan a core activity for the bulk of learners and then set something different for small groups of gifted and talented students and for small groups of lower ability, perceived lower ability students. We also see bell curve thinking in the setting of targets for pupils, and when targets are set for entire cohorts, for year groups, for example, there's often the assumption behind it that grades will inevitably fall into a bell curve distribution. I've personally seen bell curve thinking in much of the use of randomised control trials in education. So when interventions such as phonics programs have been trialled with an intervention group, and when the outcomes for that intervention group have been compared with the outcomes for a control group that phonics program hasn't been tried out on, there's an assumption that both groups are comparable in the first place, and that assumption of there being scope for comparison tends to be based on bell curve thinking, on this idea that if you were to take any class of pupils from a similar location and the pupils are similar ages, that you'll get a bell curve. You'll get the bulk of typical students, you'll get a small number that are more able, a small number that are less able, and therefore you can have an intervention and control group and the results of randomised control trials are valid. Bell curve thinking in education has come under much criticism. In a 2008 article by Fendler and Musafar, bell curve thinking is traced to probability theory in mathematics. So with probability theory, there's this notion that if you roll the dice lots of times and you plot each time the dice falls on a particular number, you'll eventually end up with a bell curve graph. And like with that, bell curve thinking in education represents a historic attempt to bring predictability to the complex process of teaching. Fendler and Musafar also highlight that bell curve thinking in education depicts the failure of some learners as inevitable. It carries with it this suggestion that there'll always be low attainers, there'll always be someone at one end of the class who doesn't pass the exam. So it lacks aspiration for all. curve thinking, according to Fendler and Musafar, also means that teachers are planning for fictional average students. They're not planning for the real children and young people in their classrooms. They're not responding to their actual points of learning, but they are preparing resources and lesson plans around hypotheticals. Inclusive teaching, in my experience, is about reality, and it's about teachers getting to know the particular misconceptions, barriers to learning, strengths of the young people in front of them and responding to those. And transformative education, inclusive education, is about seeing learning in new ways, and it's about an effort to undermine the bell curve rather than reproduce it, and to refuse to repeat those same age-old patterns of success and failure. It's about believing that education can make a difference, that an individual who is lower attaining at one point in their education can be higher attaining in the next. It's about believing that the past doesn't dictate the future. It's about rejecting the idea that if someone has low prior attainment, that doesn't mean that they're on a path to low attainment for the entirety of their time in education. Rejecting bell curve thinking is about believing the future is changeable, and that what we do as teachers in the here and now can make a difference. Thank you.